I often feel a need to over explain myself and add too much detail and give too much context. And by too much, I'm talking about from other people's perspective. To me, it seems like necessary detail. So, like, I don't really realize I'm doing it, and I can't really just cut to the chase. Like, it just doesn't, it's just not an option in my head. It's just not how my brain works. For a long time, I thought that was just being neurodivergent, and I still do think that's a piece of it. But I've come to realize that for me, there's also an element of trauma to it. And the way that I figured that out is that when I am over explaining myself and giving too much detail, I feel a little bit activated. Not like panicky, but pretty kind of intense, like kind of really locked in and like this is important and I have to get this person to understand me. Which even if it's like really not like a high stakes situation. And so I think the reason it feels a little bit intense to me is because I'm kind of triggered on some level. Triggered is probably overstated. I think activated is more honest. And what's tricky about this is I think that the trauma piece of it comes from a really like chronic little t trauma that I don't really have like really exact memories of. And I think the reason that I don't have super detailed memories of it is because it just kind of was so common and was so normal that there's not one like standout event that like really got chiseled into my memory. But kind of the general sense that I have is that often if an adult was upset, they would just kind of be convinced of which kid did something and often like what the motivation was. Like it seemed like often they just assumed that we were doing things out of bad intent. But then there was also this element of kind of like this, I guess, like authoritarian parenting view where like backtalk is this big important thing that kids can't do or that's really disrespectful. And so what I kind of think backtalk really is more often than not is just a kid explaining their perspective. But in that kind of family system, it's like the parent just kind of thinks they're right and they don't really want to hear the kid's perspective, and they just take it as like making an excuse, and like there just isn't the level of respect for that kid's view to even want to hear it. And so when you're the child in that scenario, it makes it really confusing because um, often that means you're either maybe being blamed for something you just didn't do, or maybe you did the thing but you did it with you for a reason, like you thought it made sense or you thought it was okay, or and they won't listen to your explanation. And I can recall sometimes feeling like it would make sense to lie, but also I really felt strongly that lying was bad, and like I kind of had like a moral anxiety. So I really wasn't okay with lying, and yet I felt like I was being set up to lie. And just to give you like kind of a silly example, and this is kind of like a vague answer or a vague story based on what kind of generally feels true. This isn't like a really specific memory that I actually have, but like say an adult is mad that a light was left on in a room, and then they ask you, why did you leave that light on, or why didn't you turn that light off? And then the real thing is they don't really want to know. What they're really saying is, I'm upset with you for leaving that light on, go turn it off. But it was frequently framed as a question, so if you don't say anything, that's seen as like disrespectful or like you're ignoring them, even if you like get up and do the thing. Like they want some response, but they don't want you to explain yourself, and they certainly don't want you to disagree even if you really didn't leave that light on, like even if it really was somebody else in the house. And so for me as a kid who was really fixated on feeling like I needed to be good, it really felt like a trap because like on one hand, I knew that like pleasing your parents is good. Like that's kind of this really strong message that I got. And so if they are upset with you and they want you to say that you did this thing and say that you're sorry and like fix it, then on one hand, that's what you should do. And then on the other, if I really didn't leave that light on, then saying that I did and apologizing is lying, and that's bad. And so I think that I would try to over explain, but then because I was explaining so much, like, first of all, like, just trying to explain it all is kind of like seen as rude or trying to skirt accountability or something. And then over explaining or adding even more detail to try to prove my case is sometimes read as even more like evidence to them that you are guilty. And that part I think is just like a neurotypical versus neurodivergent thing. Like I don't understand why giving more detail or more context often is assumed to be like proof that somebody's lying. Like I get that sometimes when people are lying, they'll add extra detail to try to like prove themselves when they're actually just adding more detail to the lie. But I don't think that that being true means that anybody who gives a lot of detail or a lot of context is lying. Like that's definitely not the case. Anyway, so I think that this is how I ended up with this real, like, kind of tornado that cycles between, that was my cat, that cycles between, like, my neurodivergence making me very prone to adding detail and context to begin with, and then the trauma of kind of feeling cornered and not being believed or, like, given the benefit of the doubt and, I don't even know how the morality fixation fits in there, if that it was also trauma or if that is just neurodivergence too. But all of it like really gets like muddled up together in this tornado of like spiraling and making things worse. This tic tac's long, so I'm gonna break it into two parts. I'm gonna connect this with how other kids in my family seem to become chronic liars.